Hey, shalom, shalom, shalom lakam, which is peace unto you all. Ha'i rab tawab la atam zah yakam yawam or chagadosh Charlotte, which is good evening. This is your brother Yawam from the GMS camp in Charlotte. Na chamatam kayah malakat hashemayim kwarab. Repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Call halayim la la banawa Yahweh bahasham Yahweh shai bahasham rochag wadash. Wamashana la zakonim nawa wamala akim shor chagadosh, which is our praises to our Father Yahweh, which means He exists. Bahasham, in the name Yahweh Shai, delivers in double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. This is Luke chapter 14 and verse. I'm gonna start at verse 28, or excuse me, verse 25, and it says subtitle discipleship tested. All right, in which when we've been called into this truth, ultimately we've been called to be disciples. All right, and the word disciple goes into the word for discipline. So pretty much we have to remain disciplined to the precepts. All right, because going to this is Job chapter 23. All right, and we'll get verse 10 or verse 11. It says, "My foot hath held his steps, his way have I kept and not declined." All right, starting from verse 10, it says, "But he knoweth the way that I take. When he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold." Because the elect is tried as that gold in the fire. All right, and being that the elect is tried as that gold in the fire, all right, the elect ultimately is going to make it out on the other side. Verse 11, it says, "My foot hath held his steps, his way have I kept and not declined." Because ultimately this is a proven process. Let's get this. This is Dabar Yam Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 3, and it says, verse 1, it says, "All the commandments which I command thee this day shall ye observe to do, that ye may live and multiply and go and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers. And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy power led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or no. And he suffered thee and he humbled thee and suffered thee to hunger and fed thee with manna which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee know that man doeth not live by bread only, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doeth man live." Because ultimately these terrestrial bodies, these earthly tabernacles need food to survive. All right, but when we go into the scriptures, ultimately it's the scriptures that allows us to thrive. We wasn't sent just to survive. We wasn't placed pretty much. We sinned. We went off and we essentially were placed under the curses. But ultimately creation is supposed to thrive. So what allows for us to thrive ultimately, where we truly live, is in these scriptures. All right, because bread is just going to feed the terrestrial body. It's not going to feed what is necessary for thriving. All right, and creation is about thriving. All right, not just hanging on by a thread. And what allows for us to do that is let me get a quick precept. This is Luke chapter 19. We'll get verse 22. All right, and it says, hold on. This is Luke chapter 21 and verse 19, and it says, "And your patience possess ye your souls." And ultimately how we possess our souls as we go through that straight gate, because we got Deuteronomy 8, the 8th chapter. All right, I quoted Bon Sirach, the 2nd chapter, and we got Job 23, 10 and 11. All right, because ultimately we're being tried, we're being tested. All right, and in that testing phase, that patience phase, that suffering phase, we have to possess our souls. And ultimately what allows for us to do that is these scriptures, having faith on the scriptures, because that's what pushes forth those works. That's how we're ultimately able to, hold on. All right, it's our faith, and the faith is the driving force, for the fear, because the faith without works is dead, so, and just going into that, it's going to be the elect that ultimately hold fast, to this word. All right, going back to Job 20, the 23rd chapter, the elect is going to ultimately, through all of it, the obstacles, all right, the set adversities, all right, the elect is going to hold on, all right, to these scriptures. All right, they're going to maintain that discipline. And that's pretty much why, I want to just give a backdrop on that. But this is Luke chapter 14. And what inspired this lesson, I'm going to, give me a second, Salak. Yeah, so what inspired this lesson, I was reading this. I've been in the process. I'm almost done with this book, but I've been reading this book by a general. All right, and pretty much right here, it's an excerpt out of this book called On War. All right, and it says Frederick the Great beat 80,000 Austrians at Leuthen with about 30,000 men. So 80,000 to 30,000. He had 30,000 men. He beat 80,000. It says, and at Rosbach with 25,000, some 50,000 allies. These are, however, the only instances of victories gained against an enemy double or more than double in numbers. It says Charles the I don't know what this Roman numeral is, but it's XII, and it says, well, it should be the 12th. It says, in the Battle of Narva, we cannot well quote, for the Russians were at that time hardly to be regarded as Europeans. Also, the principal circumstances even of the battle are too little known. Bonaparte had at Dresden 120,000 against 220,000, therefore not the double. All right. And which, eat the meat, spit out the bones. But pretty much the point that I wanted to get was these numbers. The numbers, the guy beat, so he had 30,000 men. All right. He beat somebody with 80,000. All right. The other example, Bonaparte had 120,000 against 220,000. All right. These men, pretty much, served as, generals in secular history, and ultimately a part of that they had to consider, because the truth speaks in similitudes, as it mentioned in Hosea 12 and verse 10. All right. So the similitude of, I'm going to go to it. This is Luke chapter 14 and verse 25. All right. Discipleship tested. It says, and there went great multitudes with him, and he turned and said unto them, if any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yet in his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. All right, which is not saying you literally hate them, It's ultimately going into nothing should be over this truth. All right, this truth comes first and everything else comes after. Verse 27. And whosoever do, because again, discipleship tested, we're on that straight gate, so we have to remain disciplined. All right, and think about discipline, when you look at, that's why this truth is comparable to a fight and to a war, you see, because warriors, soldiers, all right, ultimately they might be, getting their ass beat, but they maintain that mental fortitude, all right, the discipline, all right, through it all to get to the goal at hand, So it says, and whosoever doeth not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple, So, and which, let me get this word for cross. All right, and it says cross, G47:16. All right, and it says, let me see. Well, it don't really say anything here, but pretty much it's going into bearing what comes with this truth. The stuff that the bitter parts. Pretty much, if one couldn't go through that, all right, and maintain that discipline, all right, and pretty much, they not in the patience possessing their souls, holding on to the Lord Yahweh Shai, all right, ultimately, they ultimately are not worthy of being a disciple of the Lord, because to be a disciple, one has to have discipline. All right. And those that have discipline are going to bear their cross. All right. They're going to go through whatever it is that it takes, whatever obstacles and adversities, and have the correct mindset. All right. To push forward. All right. Which it goes back to the faith. All right. Verse 28, it says, for which of you intending to build a tower sitteth not down first and counteth the cost, whether he had sufficient to finish it. All right. And the thing about building, I got this right here, something called construction math. All right. You got different things, area, volume. All right. Let me see, circles, circumference, diameter, radius. All right. Tape measures and stuff like that. All right. Reason why these things are important, in literal construction is because one has to do mathematical equations. All right. Mathematical equations measure things. All right. If, someone was to, say a room was, just throwing out a number, 5 feet by 6 feet. All right. So 5 feet wide, 6 feet long, or vice versa. All right. If one was to paint the walls or, fill it with carpet. All right. Well, if they got 5 feet by 5 feet instead of 5 feet by 6 feet, You know, it's gonna be like, damn, like you ain't even finished, you know, the carpet, or you got half the room painted, you know. So you know that causes forth, you know, it's a laughing stock, you know, and that's why in construction they say, hey, you know, you have to pretty much you got to count the cost, consider the cost. All right, do the mathematical equations. All right, and buy extra. They say they tell them to buy extra, pretty much extra supplies, just in case, you know, they might have too little, or maybe they might mess up, you know. If they mess up, they still got extra, you know, because they know they would be a laughing stock if they wasn't able to, you know, finish a room or finish a house and stuff of that nature. That's why it's very imperative, you know, to do the mathematical equations. And in this situation right here, reading it again, Luke 14:28, it says, "For which of you intending to build a tower sitteth not down first and counteth the cost, whether he have sufficient to finish it." All right. And ultimately, those mathematical equations goes back to the faith. You know, it's the faith, you know, and the faith is going to add forth to those works. But really, again, it goes back to the faith. All right. That's what's going to be sufficient, all right, for the walk, you know, because in order for us to have to be disciplined, it first has to start with the faith, but the faith is going to, you know, push forth you know, those works. But reading it again, it says, "For which of you intending to build a tower sits not down first and count the cost, whether he have sufficient to finish it." It says, "Less happily after he had laid the foundation and is not able to finish it, all that behold it begin to mock him," you know, because it will be a laughing stock, you know, like, you know, you intended, you know, on pretty much building a house, or, you know, painting a room, or laying down carpet, flooring, you know, whatever have you, you know, and you wasn't able to finish it. All right. And which is, this truth is comparable to building a house. It's comparable to warfare. It's comparable to a fight. You see, it goes into all of these things, you see, because one has to finish. You know, you don't go into a war and, you know, like, oh, you had one battle. All right. And then now you retreating, you know, because then what did you even go into it for the first place? You know, especially if somebody had, you know, way more soldiers than you, you know, so it has to, we got to count the costs. All right. And it starts when we first come into the truth, this truth. All right. And it's a continual examination, you know. Am I doing the correct things? You know, which is where, you know, this word applies to me first and foremost. All right. Am I doing the correct things, you know, to obtain salvation? Am I, you know, walking in the correct fashion? You know, and those that are going to, you know, examine and prepare and be directed to right, all right, is ultimately going to be the elect. But finishing out, it says, "Less happily after he hath laid the foundation and is not able to finish it, all that behold it began to mock him, saying, This man began to build and was not able to finish." You know, it will be a laughing stock, you know, because if you got half a room built, you know, you got a half a room painted, it's like, damn, what about this wall? You know, or what you got half carpet in one room and then the rest of it exposed, like, damn, like what happened, you know? Verse 31, it says, "Or what king going to make war against another king sitteth not down first and consulteth whether he be able with 10,000 to meet him that cometh against him with 20,000." You know, so all of these have to be taken into effect, you know. And being that we're soldiers of the Lord Yahweh Shai, you know, we're ultimately, you know, we are all small generals in our own right, you know, in the spirit. And a general, all right, an actual general in a physical sense, all right, they think about the training, all right, you know, losses, all right, they think about provisions and tactics, you know, and which those things in this sense, all right, it's going to come with considering the cost, all right, you know, examining, all right, and so on and so forth, you know, examining ourselves. Are we ultimately walking in the correct way? But reading it again, verse 31, it says, "Or what king going to make war against another king sitteth not down first and consulted whether he be able with 10,000 to meet him that cometh against him with 20,000. The reason why I said the examining part is because, say you had like a any type of warfare, you know, if you got, you know, open field, or if it's open field or mountain warfare or so on and so forth, you got one element and another element. Are your men trained? You know, are you mentally ready? You know, what is your weaponry? All right, all that has to be taken into effect. All right, and then same for the spiritual. You know, are we ultimately training, studying? Scripture says, you know, study to shoot thyself approved. You know, and as we continue, you know, what's going to get us through it, you know, is all of the things mentioned in the scriptures. All right, and the elect is ultimately going to be a discipline to make it unto the end. But reading it again, it says, or what king going to make war against another king sitteth not down first and consulted whether he be able to with 10,000 to meet him that cometh against him with 20,000, or else while the other is yet a great way off, he sendeth an ambassage and desireth conditions of peace. So likewise, whosoever he be of you that forsaketh not all that he hath cannot be my disciple. And that ultimately, all of these precepts reading down from 25 is what it takes to be a disciple. We got to count the cost. All right, let's get this word for count. G5585, it says to count with pebbles, to compute, calculate, going back to those calculations, mentioned with the construction. All right. And then also, the warfare calculations. It says to reckon, to give one's vote by casting a pebble into the urn. It says to decide by voting. It says, so pretty much, to calculate. All right. To think, to ponder, do I have what it takes, ultimately to finish until the end, you see, because those that don't finish, all right, ultimately are going to have a worse punishment. All right. So let's get this, you see, because part of counting the cost is actually the preparation phase. This is Proverbs 24 and verse 27. And it says, prepare thy work without and make it fit for thyself in the field, and afterwards build thine house. So it's a preparation phase. You don't one wouldn't just say, oh, fuck it, I'm gonna make a house. It has to be a preparation phase. And coming into this truth, we have to have that preparation phase. And part of that preparation phase is right here. All right. This is the word for prepare. Kawan H3559. It says to be firm, stable, established, be firmly established, be secure, be fixed, be securely determined, to be directed aright. All right. And again, to be directed aright, we have how we possess our souls and the patience. Being directed right, all right, is having faith on the Lord Yahweh Shai, all right, because the Lord Yahweh Shai, he's the trailblazer, so by looking at him, and seeing what he did, he bare his cross, so we're all smaller reflections of the Lord Yahweh Shai, so we have to bear our cross, we have to go through the different obstacles and set adversities, and what's going to get us through it is the faith, all right, because going back to the example with the generals, or excuse me, the king, and Luke 14, all right. They got to count the costs and see, do they have the provisions, do they have training and so on and so forth. All right. Us being smaller generals. All right. We have to pretty much dig deep and do what it is that, that we have to do. And doing what we have to do will be, again, having faith on the Lord Yahweh Shai, and ultimately having that preparation phase. Making sure that the constant examination. Hey, am I truly established? And the thoughts that I'm having, are they stable? Are they firm? Are they rooted? It says to direct toward moral sense. All right, and am I moving in the correct moral sense? All right, because that's ultimately possessing our souls is by taking the correct steps. Like even a general, in warfare, if he went against the 10,000. Or if he went against the one with 20,000, all right, he got to think, okay, before I make this move, if I go straight on this center line, all right, yeah, I can attack, you see, but would it be better if I sent them over to flank to the right-hand side or to the left-hand side, because then ultimately, he's over, all of those people, so he can send someone to, to their proverbial death, so ultimately what again, that the preparation phase that goes back to the faith. All right. And again, the faith is what, pushes forth those works. But let's get a couple more. Let's get Proverbs 24. Are we already there? Proverbs 24 and verse 3 and 5. It says, through wisdom is an house builded, and by understanding it is established, and by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches. It says, a wise man is strong, yea, a man of knowledge increaseth strength. All right. So we got the example in Luke, the 19th chapter. Or 14th chapter. All right. And it said, the man wasn't able to pretty much, finish the building, roughly paraphrase, of the tower. All right. And how we ultimately build, verse 3, it gives us the blueprint right here. It says, through wisdom is an house builded, and by understanding it is established. So both of those are reflections of the Lord Yahweh Shai. By having faith on his word is ultimately how we are established, and ultimately how we are directed right. Verse 4. And by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches. So whereas that king ultimately, the tactics, the training, the provisions. All right, that's what he got on his mind. What we got on our mind, because it says, "And by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches." You see, because our house, we're building our house, all right, which is our spirit. All right, and the chamber, it goes into the Hebrew word chadar yam, which is inner rooms. All right, and ultimately, what we rebuild or how we build them inner rooms up. Psalms 119:9, wherewithal shall a young man cleanse his way by taking heed thereto according to thy word. So we have to build ourselves with faith in the image of the Lord, Yahweh Shai. Verse 5 says, a wise man is strong, yet a man of knowledge increaseth strength. Though a wise man is the true general. All right, verse 6 it says, just getting a little bit more edification on the verse 6. For by wise counsel thou shalt make thy war, and in multitude of counselors there is safety. So we are ultimately able to be on a spiritual be in this spiritual war. All right, because we're standing upon the rock. All right, ultimately, we're able to ultimately have safety in the Lord Yahweh Shai, because we're standing upon him. He is that rock mentioned Matthew the 7th chapter. All right, so let's get a couple more. All right, this is Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1. It says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good report. Through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of the Most High, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. You see, because ultimately those that, going back to Luke the 14th chapter, those that are going to finish their building, those that are going to have a successful proverbial war are going to be those that have true faith. All right. So it says, by faith Abel offered unto the Most High a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, the Most High testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaketh. By faith Enoch was translated, that he should not see death, and was not found, because the Most High had translated him. For before his translation he had seen this testimony, that he pleased the Most High. But without faith it is impossible to please him. So ultimately, if someone wasn't rooted in faith in the Lord Yahweh Shai, all right, how ultimately would they be able to possess their souls? All right, they're going to bug out. All right, they're not going to be able to. If one was to look at all, the hell that they was catching in the bitterness, all right, they're not ultimately going to abide, in this walk and on the straight gate. They can fall by the wayside. Verse 6, it says, but without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to the Most High must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. And ultimately how we seek the Lord is following the trailblazer, having faith, you see, because we pretty much playing a big game a small game of follow the leader. All right. So I'm gonna get one more and that'll be it. But this is Luke chapter 9. We'll get verse 62. All right, and it says, and Yahweh Shai said unto him, no man having put his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of the Most High. All right, and the man that Luke the 14th chapter, all right, that built the building, in the spiritual sense. All right, we're building, the spiritual third temple. Those that are looking back, all right, those that ultimately don't have sufficient, to finish, they're not worthy of the kingdom. They're not fit, all right, for the kingdom. All right, going back to the, the example with that, the king, all right, he didn't consider the cost. All right, if a king had 10,000 men, all right, and it was 20,000 that was adverse to him, ultimately he has to count the cost, whether he's going to be able to finish. All right, and ultimately those that again will finish are not going to look back, and they're going to have the faith. All right, they're going to have the faith in the Lord Yahweh Shai, you see, because we got what ultimately is going to stand the test. All right, Job 23 and verse 10 and 11, subscribing to this truth. All right, Deuteronomy 8 and verse 3, scripture said, or verses 2 and 3, Deuteronomy 8, 2 and 3, and went into how the Lord has proven us, you see, and he's seeing how we operate, all right, under that adversity, under those the obstacles, and the different things that he has on the straight gate for us, But reading it again, Luke 9 and 62, it says, and Yahweh Shai said unto him, no man having put his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of the Most High. So we ultimately have to consider the cost, and we got to finish. So just wanted to go into that, because again, I was reading this book, and it pretty much, just sparked in my spirit, because it pretty much said, it had 120,000 against a 220,000, and, the 120,000 had won, but that's an imperative part in this walk. We got to consider the cost, and part of considering the cost, counting the cost, it goes into being directed to right. And how we are directed to right is by having faith in the Lord Yahweh Shai, because having faith in the Lord Yahweh Shai and seeking the Lord, all right, as we got in Hebrews, the 11th chapter, and verse 6, it says, but without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that so without faith is where it starts. It says, but without faith it is impossible to please him, because after the faith, the faith, those that truly believe are going to have the works. It says, but without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to the Most High must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. So those that are diligently seeking the Lord, Yahweh Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, are going to follow the steps that were already paved, all right, by the Lord Yahweh Shai. All right, and the Lord Yahweh Shai, he bare his cross, so being that we got to be smaller examples, smaller reflections of the Lord Yahweh Shai, we got to bear our cross. All right, we got to do things that's written in the scriptures. So just want to go into that. I don't want to Zabanaya Paulos, that was a beautiful edification to the spirit. Wa don't want to Zatham Yashlai Lata Lord's will. You have a good day. Excuse me, good night. Washalam Lakam, which is peace to you all. Shalom, shalom.